Humorous Faces to Snail Races, 100 Years of Cinema Animation. Though often considered to be for children, animation has played a large role in the evolution of America.
Hey, what's going on here?
It has gone through a metamorphosis of simple and soundless motion pictures that last simply 5 seconds, to slightly longer and more comedic shorts, to being a tool to propagate World War II news, all the way to the stunning and detailed 3D animation that we see in our theaters today. Long before animation began to show up in theaters or in homes, Hollywood itself was ruled by silent, black-and-white films that were mostly comedic. Exaggerated faces and movements combined and easy-to-understand storylines paved the industry. Long before this, there were different methods people had created that greatly resembled the idea of a succession of images, slightly different than the last, flying by each other to create movement. An easy example is the flipbook, a tool still used today. The first flipbook was made by the British lithograph printer John Barnes Linnet in 1868. He called his invention a kineograph, literally meaning a moving picture. In 1892, the first stop-motion film was created by Émile Reynard, a Frenchman. It was titled Pauvre Parrot. The short film lasted 5 minutes, and has now been translated into color. It was made using a drawn setting. Then a piece of cut and colored paper was moved slowly around the board. They took different pictures at each movement. Whenever the figure needed to change position, they would make a new drawing in that position. Today, many have brought up the point that this film should be considered animation and not stop motion, though it is still usually considered the latter by a majority of historians due to its slow-paced nature and animation process. 14 years later, in 1906, a man by the name of James Stewart Blackton created Humorous Phases of Funny Faces, which is officially considered to be the first animated film. It is completely silent. It was published and distributed by the Vitagraph Company of America. In the cartoon, hand-drawn scenes appear on a chalkboard, such as a clown playing with a hat and a dog jumping through a hoop. In the beginning, the movements are shown in normal live action. Seconds later, you are surprised as the pictures begin to move on their own. This film was not immediately a breakthrough, and took almost 1 year to gain the recognition it deserved. Though, when it finally did break the ice, it was shown all across America. After its showing, it pegged a large, ominous question upon Americans. Everyone was wondering if this new technique would be destined to dominate the film industry. People everywhere imagined what life would be like if movies could be made by one man, a chalkboard, and a camera. They imagined the wonderful stories that could pop out of the movie screen with virtually no limitations. On the other side of the globe, an anonymous Japanese man created the first animated film in Japan. The exact date is unknown, but it is estimated that it was created around 1907, only 1 year after Humorous Faces of Funny Faces. It is important to note that it is purely coincidental that these two films popped up at virtually the exact same time in history. Historians have concluded that it would be nearly impossible for this new movie technique to make its way across the world, especially with the increasing tension between the US and Japan. Phantasmagorie is a film from 1908 which was the first to use traditional animation. Traditional animation became the method used for animation for over several decades before computer animation took over. Gertie the Dinosaur came out in 1914. It was incredibly advanced for its time, and it was truly the breakthrough film that showed the world the true potential of animating. Comic strips found in newspapers were also a common source of inspiration for animators in the following years. A few different pieces from a comic book titled Keeping Up with the Jonases were animated. These were especially prominent because there were 2 different series created, one for women and one for men. Sadly, this was part of the obvious beginning of sexism in the animation industry. Animation continued to grow in popularity for years, and animators began to experiment with how far they could take their animation. One title that will be easily recognized from this time period is Steamboat Willie, the first film to be synchronized with sound by one of the most recognizable names in the film industry, Walt Disney. Though Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs would not be released for almost 2 decades, Disney had already begun to build himself his own name. Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse had both taken their rightful place in the culture of the 30s. Disney's way of thinking and creating was so different from every other animator, even the government began to keep a watchful eye on his work. The United States government observed closely how animated cartoons had already begun to seep into America's roots. During the midst of World War II, the United States government approached Walt Disney and offered to pay him to create animated shorts. These shorts encouraged support of the government and educated soldiers on their duties. Of course, he took the offer without a second thought, and over the 6-year war, Walt Disney created several short films for each branch of the military. He used his iconic characters to encourage Americans to donate their scraps and buy war bonds. And Disney didn't only do this for the much-needed funding, he was incredibly patriotic himself. A famous quote of his reads, "If you look close in my eyes, the American flag is waving in both of them, and my spine is glowing this red, white, and blue stripe."
After eating, you were enjoying a crumb.
These cartoons were not only biased in favor of America, but several also showed extremely racist undertones and depictions of Japanese people. In 1943, Tokyo Jokyo was released. It is considered to be one of the most racist films of all time. Months after the U.S. dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, people began to worry about this newfound atomic power. An independent company made an educational film that urged the government to destroy all nuclear weapons, or only use them as a power source. It illustrated several valid points and described that atom bombs are much too powerful for humans to control. This all occurred throughout the golden age of animation, which lasted between 1928 and 1969. During this time, animation regularly used sound and color together. This is the time period in which most popular old films were released. This includes, but is not limited to, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Betty Boop, Casper the Friendly Ghost, Pink Panther, and The Jungle Book. Animation is widely considered to be at its peak during this time. Animation had completely paved its way into America's culture as a tool for expression, entertainment, and awareness. These films featured many things, like exaggerated characteristics of African Americans, showing them as monkey-like creatures who would commonly act less human than the white characters on screen. In 1941, a now-removed scene from Dumbo showed a group of crows that greatly resembled these racial stereotypes. One was named Jim Crow after the Jim Crow laws on the segregated South, and he was voiced by a white man using a racist accent.
When I see an elephant fly.
What you say, boy?
I said when I see an elephant fly.
Time went on. Animation continued to evolve. It became more complicated and produced in higher quality. People began to experiment with the idea of using computers. For example, in 1977, Star Wars, A New Hope, used effects that would later become the basic fundamentals of computer animation. Jurassic Park, 1993, animated their dinosaurs into the scene using computers. Before then, people had begun to experiment with computer animation as early as the 50s. 2 years later, the first fully computer-animated film was released, Toy Story. Toy Story was a breakthrough in the world of computer animation. It showed that with a hardworking team and a few dozen computers, you could animate your story without using a scrap of paper, as well as the idea of three-dimensional stories, which brought these make-believe worlds into even more complexity. Quickly, other studios latched onto this technique. It was much cheaper than the alternative. As the next few decades passed, traditional animation was almost completely abandoned and replaced with computers. Even though animation has gone through its own ups and downs and is plagued with a racist past, with both whitewashing and racial stereotypes, it has also paved a bright path for thousands of people to express themselves creatively. And as we saw, it is not only useful for entertainment, but for education. Animation is a cheap way to show feelings and emotions while telling stories that simply could not exist with a live cast. Throughout the 1900s, famous characters such as Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, Bugs Bunny, and Betty Boop have found their way into America's culture and history. With the newfound world of animation, the entirety of cinema was permanently changed.